Hi. All right. Are you all hearing me?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes, very well.
all right. Good. So my presentation is about reception in Malta, reception of irregular migrants and asylum seekers. Change slide, please. I will start with a word on our initial reception of irregular migrants. Basically, our reception system is three-tiered. We have initial reception, we have detention, and we also have open center accommodation. So, what is initial reception? In essence, the idea is that people who are newly arrived in Malta are accommodated in an initial reception center until their medical clearance is issued. At this stage, they are also interviewed and fingerprinted by the police, and the first step towards asylum application is also taken. These centers are managed by our agency for the welfare of asylum seekers, AWAS. Now, the initial reception centers may actually operate in two formations. They may either be open in the sense that people may move in and out at certain points during the day, or if circumstances require, they may also be closed. Sometimes part of the IRC is open and part of the IRC is closed, depending mainly on considerations relating to health. Next slide, please. Right. Um, so basically, at this stage, when people are in the IRC, the principal immigration officer, who is actually the commissioner of police, decides on whether to issue detention orders or else to impose alternatives to detention in respect of the individuals who are at the IRC. Actually, these measures, detention orders and alternatives to detention, are not imposed on vulnerable persons. Detention actually may also apply, obviously, to people who do not apply for international protection, but in that case, a different legal regime would apply. I will move on to explain that later. Next slide, please. Now, this is an overview of the police assessment while the migrants are at the initial reception stage. As such, it explains what I've set out so far. Basically, after the initial reception stage, a person may be taken to detention on the basis of either two different legal bases. Article 8 of the reception conditions regulations, if he or she is an asylum seeker. On the other hand, if he or she is being detained in preparation for return, what applies is the return directive and nationally our return regulations that transpose the directive. The other possibility is alternatives to detention, which are imposed whenever detention is not deemed necessary, but it is considered that there might be a risk of absconding. And the third alternative available to police is to impose neither detention nor alternatives, in which case the persons in question would be accommodated in an open center. Next stage, please. The next slide, please. Now, I move on to discuss the reception conditions regulations and the detention of asylum seekers. Now, whenever the police issue detention orders in respect of asylum seekers, they do so in writing, and they also give the reasons as to why detention is being resorted to. Although different reasons may be given in accordance with the directive and the regulations that transpose it, amongst the most common we find to determine identity and nationality. In accordance with our law, detention orders are reviewed after a period of 7 days or possibly 14, by an independent authority, which is the Immigration Appeals Board. And basically, the board decides on whether to continue the detention or not. And people who are placed in detention fall under the responsibility of the detention service, which administers detention centers. Next slide, please. Now, as I was saying, it is possible for the principal immigration officer to also detain people who do not apply for asylum, or else who had previously applied for asylum and had their application rejected. This detention is pursued specifically with a view to returning the people in question to their country of origin. So basically, in some cases at least, these people would be accommodated in a detention center until such time as the return is effected. The detention under these grounds is actually reviewed after a period of 3 months by the principal immigration officer himself, again in line with relevant EU legislation. Next slide, please. Obviously, detention in terms of the, so that's done. Wish I should have another slide actually here. Return regulations and detention too. In any case, basically what I was going to say about detention is that after 6 months, yes, that's right, after 6 months of detention, basically a second review would be carried out, this time by the Independent Immigration Appeals Board. However, I would have to point out that someone may be released from detention at any point if it is established that the return cannot be affected, because basically a return under these regulations is only possible so long as it is possible for the authorities to affect the return. All right, I now move on to open centers. Now, open centers are the third tier in our system, in our accommodation system. As such, the people who end up here are the people very often who come into Malta regularly, apply for asylum, and do not have a place to stay. Some of these persons may enter from a detention center, or else they may be accommodated directly in an open center from the IRC. Excluding vulnerable persons, migrants are allowed to stay at open centers for a maximum of 6 months. I now move on to the asylum system, just a very brief overview of asylum determination. Next slide, please. Now, asylum determination. Basically, applications for international protection here in Malta are determined by the International Protection Agency. Until recently, this was known as the Office of the Refugee Commissioner, but it's been given the status of an agency. As such, the office may grant 3 types of protection, 2 of them emanating from European law and international law, these being refugee status and subsidiary protection. It is also possible to grant someone temporary humanitarian protection, which is a national form of protection. This is usually awarded to people who do not qualify for the other forms of protection, but who are deemed to require protection nonetheless, and are therefore offered this type of protection. Basically, the IPA, the International Protection Agency, hears applications at first instance. Then we have a second authority, the Refugee Appeals Tribunal, which basically hears appeals from refugee and subsidiary protection claims. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. right? Um, um, Rights of migrants in the asylum system. Just a brief word here. Basically, refugees are entitled to access employment, social welfare, accommodation, and state medical care, whereas beneficiaries of subsidiary protection and THP are entitled to substantially the same benefits, but social welfare is limited to what we call core benefits, again, in line with EU law. These forms of protection, or larger refugee and subsidiary protection, are renewed every 3 years, whereas THP is renewed once every year. And in terms of the law, asylum seekers have an entitlement to access to the labour market after a period of 9 months, though in practice they are allowed to access the labour market earlier. Next slide, please. Now some irregular migration data. Just to put you in the picture on migration in Malta. As such, irregular migration started being an issue here in Malta more or less in 2002. In that year, we received 1,600 irregular immigrants by boat. The following year, 2003, saw a further 520 arriving, and then the numbers remained more or less stable at around 1,500 or over between 2004 and 2007. Then we recorded a record number in 2008 of 2,775. In the following years, arrivals remained more or less constant, though we had lower influxes in 2010, 15, 16, and 17. However, over 2,000 reached Malta in 2013 and a little less than 1,500 in 2018. Last year was actually a new record. The number of arrivals more than doubled at 3,405. This is the largest number of irregular migrant arrivals ever registered in Malta. As at 20th August this year, the number of arrivals already stood at over 2,000. Next slide. Now, what this means in practice is that all reception facilities are currently subject to considerable pressure. Obviously, with the doubling of the number of arrivals between 2019 and 2019, the fact that we received also a considerable number this year, basically this means that all our facilities are very much subject to pressure. COVID-19 actually imposed new challenges. One of the main problems that we faced is that we've had to place our largest open center under quarantine for up to 40 days. Obviously, this has had a significant adverse impact on our ability to receive people in our reception system. And obviously, this compromised Malta's ability to continue disembarking irregular migrants, a problem that was also experienced by Italy. Next slide, please. Next, a word about European and international challenges and approaches. Okay, so first, a word about Intra-EU Relocation. Obviously, this presentation was written before the pact, although, to be fair, practically all these points still apply. Malta has sought assistance, especially at European level, for a number of years. One of the most important forms of assistance in Malta's case is intra-EU relocation, whereby a number of asylum seekers are relocated to other EU member states. And here I have listed some of the member states that have assisted Malta in this manner. France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and others have helped us in this regard, and Norway as well. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, these initiatives have relieved some of the pressure on Malta, and of course, Maltese government is very grateful for the assistance that we received. We still consider, though, that the EU needs a more permanent system for solidarity, including by way of intra-EU relocation. This is something that is mentioned by the pact, although the wording is not clear exactly how mandatory this will be. We also considered that ideally a permanent relocation mechanism would have formed part of the Dublin regulation. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. Anyway, yes, basically the next slide is just a few words about NGO vessels. As you all know, a number of interception of migrant vessels have taken place over the last few years by NGO assets. Obviously, these have have translated into a demand for disembarkation in Malta, including disembarkation of persons who were rescued outside Malta search and rescue region. You will understand that in the circumstances I have outlined, this poses very significant challenges for the country. This is especially the case when considering that our reception capacity, of course, is not unlimited. And right now, the number of persons in accommodation, in the reception accommodation, amounts to roughly 1% of the population of Malta. As to a solution, we consider the solution must involve Libya in the sense that migrant smuggling networks must be controlled. And I would add that we need to encourage the Libyan authorities and work with them in order for them to improve reception conditions in Libya itself. I mean, this is a solution that requires several approaches. And of course, we would also have to consider, especially in an EU context here, the identification of alternative safe places of disembarkation besides frontline member states. This is an important consideration, in my view. I move on to the conclusion now. Just a few concluding remarks, really, before I take your questions. Basically, Malta continues to fulfill its obligations in this sector, even where circumstances, as I have outlined, are proving to be increasingly difficult. Ad hoc relocations have been and still are important, and they have eased Malta's pressure. However, we still consider that in the face of the current situation in the Mediterranean, a more permanent EU solidarity mechanism remains a prerequisite, basically. Of course, the current rate of arrivals could well prove unsustainable in the medium to long term unless we work together with a view to identifying more durable solutions, and part of the solution must involve our neighbors to the south, both when it comes to curbing migrant smuggling and also with a view to improving reception conditions and conditions in general in its territory. That is it from me. Thank you.